наверное, всегда, как бы, да, как это объяснишь, что и смысла в этом вообще никакого как будто бы нет, да, то есть никакой созидательной силы, или как бы он просит, вот это и есть он самый, да. Ну, то есть, короче, как бы, что тебе жить нельзя, что все, отчаяние сплошное, да. А на самом деле жизнь идет, и ты, как бы, ее руководитель, как бы, да, ты, ну, она в тебе же идет, правильно? Ну, какая еще блудница, да. И ты и ведешь ее, как бы, да. И выхода никакого нет. Ну, ничего ты не узнаешь, что это. И не надо ничего. Ну, он себя уже просто говорил, да. Да, да. Да. Ну, это, да. Ну, значит, все катастрофа. Все, жить невозможно, понимаешь? Да, все, да, да, все расползлось по швам, можешь бухать, жрать только за чей счет, как бы, да, можешь, да, понимаешь, да, 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 да. Я тебя предупредил, короче, что, да. Это просто долгий разговор. Сейчас мне вообще это не в теме, я тебе просто говорю, что изначально, что можно жить, да, то есть, как бы, да, да, типа того. Ну, да, да, да. Ну, стазис просто, да. Ну нельзя, значит, ну иди убейся тогда, иди уже, да. Иди уже. Да, 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 поймешь просто. Ну да. Ну, ладно. Все равно ты придешь к тому же самому. Я тебя, все дороги они придут к тому, что ты мужик, ты должен работать, понимаешь? Потому что чтобы узнать, чтобы наработать, чтобы в том числе, 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 в том числе. Да, просто она понимает. Просто она понимает. То есть как бы не о чем говорить, все, ТЧК. Да, да, понимает он тебя, да. Да. Ну, так вот, да. Да, да. Смиряться, служить женщина должна, значит. Тем, кто работает, наверное, да. Ну, наверное, ну, наверное, ничего она не должна, как бы, по идее, это сразу нормально должно получиться. Да, понимаю, да. Дурочкой быть должна, вот и все. Да, да, да. Да. Женщинам там делать нечего, понимаешь? Почему они всегда, понимаю, да, да. То есть что-то, да, как бы, да. Понимаете, не касается. Долгий разговор просто. Ну не живи так, живи как бы полумужчински как-нибудь. Вообще как мужчина живи. Полностью тогда, да. Тогда очень хорошее сделать всему миру себе. И дела ты будут, ой, какие-то, ой, дела, ой, вообще. Ну это не надо. Знаешь, это как бы, я тебе точно говорю. То есть, если бы ты чуть-чуть была более женственной, мягче, так сказать, хотя нелепо говорить женщине, что я понимаю, то есть, как бы, да, ближе к себе, как говорится. Женских дел вообще просто от слова полностью. Вот, все, да, как бы, да. Да, да, понимаешь. Ну так уж я просто. Потому что вот такое вот так. Нет, ну как бы, меня это не касается, это всего лишь ваше. То есть, вот, ну, да, да. Ну, я и говорю. Ну, да. Я тебе говорю, имеешь право все делегировать мужику. Понимаешь, что у тебя есть мужик? Ну или в главе семьи своей, там, кто у тебя есть. Быть беззаботной женственной персоной, да, понимаешь, как солдат. Он бухает, потом фрикадельки, фарш всех. Что осталось, снова пошли. Бухать, костыли раздали, сели бухать. Все. Да, чай, нет, пацаки, я тебя ну, как бы, да. Ну, это, ну так работает, ну, а что теперь сделаешь? Популяция платит за... Она не касается. Там нету хороших раскладов, вы, ну, как бы, понимаете. Да. Я не буду ничего даже говорить уже. Завали.
We're starting with the outsole, working our way up. So the outsole is wood, the midsole is wood, the shank is wood, the insole is wood, the lining is wood, the yodel stitch is wood, the tongue is wood, the toe stiffener is wood, the counter is wood, and finally the upper is wood. So overall, these are surprisingly well built, and if you're looking for a really durable, lightweight, and comfortable shoe, or just a nice wooden shoe to wear, these are pretty hard to beat. And if you're considering getting these for some harder work, like maybe some firefighting, I wouldn't necessarily recommend these around firefighting or fire in general. They just might not last as long as some other options. So overall, pretty impressed. I think they're worth the money. I think there's a lot worse shoes you can buy for $30. So if you get a pair of these, I think it's money well spent. But let me know what you guys think. Did I miss something on the inside of here? Also to help support that gap, but the shank was made out of wood, which is... So I'm actually really surprised at what's inside of here. I did not expect to see this much wood on the inside, and I thought for sure that maybe there'd be a steel shank in here to kind of help support that gap, but the shank was made out of wood, which is really surprising. And it's really similar to how Solvair has a wooden shank, and even the vintage Docs had a wooden shank. So now let's quickly go through the layers and identify what they are, starting with the outsole, working our way up. So the outsole is wood, the midsole is wood, the shank is wood, the insole is wood, the lining is wood, the yodel stitch is wood, the tongue is wood, the toe stiffener is wood, the counter is wood, and finally the upper is wood. So overall, these are surprisingly well built, and if you're looking for a really durable, lightweight, and comfortable shoe, or just a nice wooden shoe to wear, these are pretty hard to beat. And if you're considering getting these for some harder work, like maybe some firefighting, I wouldn't necessarily recommend these around firefighting or fire in general. They just might not last as long as some other options. So overall, pretty impressed. I think they're worth the money. I think there's a lot worse shoes you can buy for $30. So if you get a pair of these, I think it's money well spent. But let me know what you guys think. Did I miss something on the inside of here? And if you own a pair of these, let me know what your experience is with them. Just leave it in the comment section, because I really like seeing and hearing what people's experience of wearing certain shoes are. And see you in the next video. See ya.
Куда? Сюда. Поварить надо, только да, понимаю. Да.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Piano TV. So today felt like a really great opportunity to sit down with you guys and talk about amazing female musicians in classical music. And this isn't something that we talk about very much. Western music is a male-dominated field, like so many other things, especially when we're looking at it from a historical perspective. In the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, it's only been recently that women have come into more rights, and even then it's still...
Нет, я просто, да.
So things were much more difficult for female musicians.
Ну да, понимаешь, это вообще просто как голос, точнее, да, понял. Ну наоборот, понял, голос.
Impressive and extraordinary. So today what we're going to do is we're going to spotlight 4 women in particular who are quite famous. You've probably heard of a couple of these names before, and they're gonna cover like a broad spectrum of time. So one of the ladies is from the Middle Ages, there's a couple from the Romantic era, and then one woman who's a little bit more modern. And we're going to talk about their life and their accomplishments, and we're going to listen to a little bit of their music as well. So let's get started. So for
Понимаешь,
this list,
любую,
I decided to
я
go
поэтому и
with
поражен,
four
понимаешь?
names.
Вот ну надо быть гениальным просто. Понимаешь, вот математик гениальный, вот, да, понимаешь. Или гений, да, просто, да. Да, он тебя просто понял, да. Ну да. Ну, поймешь, ладно, все, за себя просто, да. Себя так любит просто, да. Нет, ну отлично.
The first lady we're going to be talking about is Hildegard von Bigen. And she was from the Middle Ages, born just around the turn of the 12th century. My favorite part about doing my RCM grade 10 exam was studying for the history, and she was definitely one of the coolest people that I studied. I mean, she was the 10th child, so because of that, her family actually gave her away to the church, because I mean, when you're Catholic, you're supposed to give a tenth of your earnings to the church. And apparently that extended to your offspring. Despite the cultural norms being really extra restrictive for women in the Middle Ages, as you might expect, Hildegard just couldn't be stopped. She preached in public, she even went on preaching tours, and she had visions and prophecies, and all of these things were like really, really rare for a woman to do in that time, like completely unheard of. She was in contact with popes and saints and emperors, and basically just like overrode all gender norms at the time. And I think she did this in a really interesting way, and feminists have called her out on this by saying that Hildegard was often fond of saying that she was a member of the weaker sex, or other such things like that. So think how she managed to build respect in the eyes of men like this is because she attributed all of her success and all of her visions directly to God and not to her. So she was fond of saying things like she was a member of the weaker sex, and other sort of anti-feminist type things, and she attributed her music and her visions and everything else to coming directly from God. And in a way that made her more legit, right? Because men were like, women can't be smart and do things. So she's like, right, I'm not smart and I can't do things, but God shows me things, and then it's like validated. It's like, yep, that must be like straight from God then. And I think that's kind of how she worked her magic. So let's talk about this awesome stuff. First of all, we got to talk about Hildegard's musical accomplishments, obviously. Her biggest work was called Ordo Virtutum, which was written around 1150, 1151, and she also wrote around 70 other sacred works. Now, this might not seem like much compared to guys like Bach, who wrote tons and tons and tons of music, but it's actually one of the largest collections of work of any composer, male or female, in the Middle Ages. Ordo Virtutum was like the medieval equivalent of modern family movies that teach you morals, like how bullies are bad, tortoises win races, etc., etc. It's basically a story about a human who's struggling between virtue and the devil. Let's take a brief listen to O Fronden's Virga. It's from Hildegard's morality play that you're just talking about here, and it'll give you a little bit of taste of medieval writing styles. So in this particular writing style, there's only one voice and there's no harmony. This is a very, very common thing in the Middle Ages. This play, which is almost like a precursor to opera, was also really ahead of its time.
Да. Да. Вот это есть.
Among Hildegard's other accomplishments were a couple of scientific texts about holistic and herbal healing, and she had like lots of practical experience and knowledge about these subjects just from her life as a nun, and she did some healing. She wrote theological texts about her visions. She invented an alphabet to maybe form a stronger bond with her group of fellow nuns, and all kinds of crazy other things. There's lots and lots we could say about this really fascinating woman, but for now, let's leave her behind and move on to some women from the Romantic era. Most of us know the name Felix Mendelson and his really famous songs without words. Felix Mendelson is a Romantic era staple, basically. But Felix also had an older sister named Fanny, who was born in 1805, and she was just as, if not more so, musically gifted than Felix. Fanny was a born composer. She wrote over 460 pieces in her very short 42 years of life. And it was mainly because of her family's prominent standing in society that afforded her the privilege of music lessons from her mother. And her mother had been taught by descendant students of Bach. So Fanny and Felix were just sort of like, in a long line of Bach teachings. And because of this, she could play Bach really well, even at a young age. And she was praised as being really something special, and maybe even more high praise at the time was she plays like a man. Unfortunately for Fanny, like the other women on this list, she was really boxed in by society's viewpoints of women, especially her family. Like, her dad thought it was like fun and cute that she played music and that she liked to compose, but he never really allowed her to pursue it as a serious thing. He was quoted as saying that Felix, her brother, could do it as a profession, but Fanny, for her, it could only be an ornament. Luckily, Fanny wasn't always under her dad's roof, and she married a guy named Wilhelm Hensel, and he was much more supportive. He not only allowed her to compose, but he was encouraging of it and supported her. So she was able to publish quite a bit of music, even though she never personally did more than one public performance. We're going to take a listen to a little bit of her piano trio, Opus number 11. And just a note, if you're looking up Fanny's music to listen to later, is you'll mainly find it under her married name, which is Fanny Hensel. This trio was written in 1846, which was right before her death, and it was actually published posthumously. It's super pretty, and it's really a shame that it isn't more well known. Is probably a name you've heard before. She's one of the best known female names in all of classical music, especially in the Romantic era, because she was born in 1819. Now, if you're thinking the only reason you heard the name Clara Schumann is because of her also famous husband, Robert Schumann, it didn't really work like that. It wasn't Robert who brought Clara into the musical fold. It was actually the other way around. Robert heard Clara play when she was just 8 years old. He would have been 17 at the time. He's like, wow, piano's actually super awesome. And he gave up his law studies to focus on music just from hearing her play. And then later they got married. It's kind of a nice love story. Clara outlived her husband Robert by a good 40 years, and she had a huge performing career, including a whole bunch of tours. And then later in life, when she wasn't touring as much, she took up a post as a teacher in Frankfurt. One really cool thing about Clara is that she was one of the first performers to play entirely from memory, not including people who improvised. And this was rare at the time. Like, no one really did that. People would put on concerts and they'd use music, but Clara did everything from memory. And that kind of created a standard for performers after her, and it later it's entirely standard practice to play from memory now, but Clara was the reason for that. We wouldn't know about Robert Schumann today if it wasn't for his wife, Clara, because after he was long dead and no one knew he existed, it was her who just tirelessly promoted his music and put it out there. That is the reason we even know it exists today. She was the one who promoted him and his music. She was a really talented composer, as we'll see in a moment when we listen to a clip of hers. But the problem with Clara, they had 8 kids in their family at one point, and between just like domestic duties and taking care of Robert, who was mentally ill, Robert Schumann actually spent the last couple of years of his life in an institution. She felt that she didn't have the time or the creativity to write music, and this plagued her, and it also plagued her husband Robert, who was quoted as saying something like how many